This is Sean Spruce, host of Native America Calling. We bring Indigenous voices to the nation. But with the elimination of federal funding, we need your help to make sure these voices are heard. Go to the donate link at nativeamericacalling.com to make a gift today. Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. For more than a half century, the U.S. contributed billions of dollars a year in cash, food, medicine, and other goods to indigenous people in other countries. It helped those people survive, but also headed off other problems like the spread of disease and the growth of criminal enterprises. In a matter of weeks, the Trump administration stopped that aid. We'll discuss the immediate and long-range consequences of halting U.S. foreign aid to indigenous people right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Arizona's 22 tribes rely on federal dollars to fund programs and even to pay some employees. But as KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrazio reports, two valley-based tribal communities say the ongoing government shutdown should have limited effect.
Governor Stephen Roe Lewis of the Gila River Indian community shared in a video message that his administration has been crafting a contingency plan to fund essential services for up to 90 days. The longest shutdown was during President Trump's first term and lasted 35 days.
So our plan should more than cover a shutdown, but we will also have plans in place should a longer, unprecedented shutdown occur. And I also want to assure you that we don't anticipate any interruption in any of our community programs at this time.
That optimism was echoed in prepared remarks by Martin Javier, president of the neighboring Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community.
While this may cause some disruption, I want to reassure you that our tribal departments remain fully operational and staff are committed to delivering the services you count on every day.
Nearly 31,000 employees have been furloughed by the Interior Department, including more than a third of all Bureau of Indian Affairs staff. The National Congress of American Indians has even created a survey urging tribes across Indian country to share their experiences on how the current shutdown is impacting them. For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrazio.
A new pitch competition is looking for Indigenous entrepreneurs in Michigan who have ideas for startups. IPR's Claire Keenan-Kurgan has more.
IndigiPitch will give Native Americans in Michigan a chance to compete for cash prizes to get a startup off the ground. Shiloh Slumsky is the financial officer and tribal liaison for 20 Fathoms, a Traverse City-based group that's organizing the competition. She says Michigan's Indigenous communities are full of creative business ideas.
We're taught to not waste anything and to utilize everything that we take. And in order to utilize everything we take, it really takes an innovative mindset to be able to do that.
Slumsky is looking for applications from Native Americans in Michigan who have startup ideas and from Native small business owners who want to have a vendor booth at the event. It's on December 5th at the Ottawa Casino in Petoskey. Applications are open until October 13th. For National Native News, I'm Claire Keenan-Kurgan.
Chickasaw Nation Governor Bill Anatubby says the Chickasaw Nation is strong as he delivered the State of the Nation address.
Fellow Chickasaws, I'm honored to report to you today that the state of the Chickasaw Nation is remarkably strong, and the best is yet to come.
He gave the speech during the Oklahoma Tribe's annual meeting and festival. Anatubby highlighted a number of tribal issues, including its diverse business portfolio, which he says continues to expand. He also touched on expanding education, healthcare, and other programs. Anatubby talked about the importance of collaboration, including for public safety and infrastructure projects.
By continuing government-to-government relations with local, tribal, state, and federal partners, and cultivating partnerships with agencies, institutions, and many other organizations, we assure mutual growth and vitality for the Chickasaw Nation and the communities throughout Oklahoma.
Anatobi emphasized the tribe's commitment to language and cultural preservation. The address was followed by a parade and activities which are part of the week-long festival. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Kawanak Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Support by Amerind, Indian Country's 100% tribally owned insurance partner. Information on property, liability, workers' compensation, and commercial auto needs at AMERIND.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. One of the first targets on President Donald Trump's agenda to reduce government spending is a federal agency tasked with improving food security and public health in foreign countries. The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, was established in 1961 to counter the Soviet Union influence in other countries during the Cold War. It carried out humanitarian aid to impoverished nations, including indigenous communities throughout the world. In the agency's recent history, it attempted to incorporate more indigenous rights and consultation into policy. Now the agency has been shut down, leaving former USAID employees and supporters worried about the United States standing in the world and in remote indigenous communities. The medical journal The Lancet projects cuts to USAID could result in 14 million deaths globally by 2030. That includes more than 4.5 million children under 5 years old. Please join our conversation today. Let us know your thoughts, your insights, ask a question. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Sandra Lazarte. She is the former Indigenous Peoples and Climate Advisor for USAID. She is Quechua. Sandra, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling.
Hi, Sean. Thank you very much.
Joining us from Massachusetts is Brian Keene. He is the co-founder of Land is Life and a former rapporteur for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the first advisor on Indigenous Peoples Issues for United States Foreign Assistance. Brian, hello to you as well. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for the invitation.
Joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Andrew Miller, and he is the Advocacy Director for Amazon Watch. Andrew, hello. Great to have you on the show today as well.
Great to be here and great to be with a lot of other excellent colleagues.
And joining us from Mount Vernon, Virginia, is Leonardo Kripa. He is the senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. He is Koya, an Argentinian indigenous tribe. Leonardo, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
The pleasure is mine, John. Thank you.
Let's begin with a clip from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio from video by C-SPAN. He's voicing his criticisms of USAID back in February as the administration was dismantling it.
My frustration with USAID goes back to my time in Congress. It's a completely unresponsive agency. It's supposed to respond to policy directives of the State Department, and it refuses to do so. So the functions of USAID, there are a lot of functions of USAID that are going to continue, that are going to be part of American foreign policy, but it has to be aligned with American foreign policy. I said very clearly during my confirmation hearing that every dollar we spend and every program we fund, that will be aligned with the national interest of the United States. And USAID has a history of sort of ignoring that and deciding that there's somehow a global charity separate from the national interest. These are taxpayer dollars.
That was Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about the now shuttered USAID. And Sandra, I'd like to begin with you and adding to what we just heard from Secretary of State Rubio. The administration characterizes USAID as wasteful spending, and it's no secret Donald Trump also campaigned on making changes to foreign aid. So it begs the question, is wasteful an accurate word to describe the role of USAID globally?
Yeah, Sean, listening to the statements that have been said by USAID makes me sad. It is not a wasteful spending. Having USAID as a soft power in the world help United States to not only to work with the people in these countries, but also to make business. Hearing that USAID has not been an agency that was accountable it makes me sad, as I said, but it's not true, because after he made those statements, the former administrator, Andrew Natsios, went into many panels to speak that the accountability of USAID was one of the highest. And it did help United States on their standing around the world and the legitimacy that they have not to only do business, but to have presence and to spread what Marco Rubio says as the American policies, right? So I disagree totally with him. I know that there have been criticisms about the bureaucracy, as many government agencies. USAID was victim of its own size, perhaps. There were changes that needed to be done. We were aligned to do those changes after assessments and evaluations and proper measures taken. People were open to do that. And at the beginning of the changes, we were doing that. We were aligning to the America First policy before everything fell down. And we were aligning to the executive orders they gave us. So, no, I don't think so that USAID was a wasteful spending. Unfortunately, people will know this later. They will feel the consequences later.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that more. How will they feel those consequences, and specifically with regard to indigenous communities in other parts of the world?
So look at, for example, the climate crisis that we are living right now. The effects of La Nina, El Nino are being very severe in many countries, right? And to protect forests, to mitigate the effects of greenhouse gases, to work on resilience for communities, to work on even producing products for value chains for different private companies. Even that, you need to protect the forest. And who are the best stewards on protecting forests? So far, they have proved that the indigenous peoples have the knowledge, the ancestral knowledge, the ecological knowledge to protect the forest, to help us counter these effects of the climate change. And many countries are prioritizing this around the world, right? Especially the small countries are prioritizing this around the world. So we needed to make partnership with these countries for United States to continue their legitimacy, to continue making business with these countries. USAID was there to promote these partnerships. With its policy, with climate change strategy, we were there to partner with the guardians of the forest that will help these countries to continue producing, sourcing for global companies, all these things. This is very key that, of course, people don't realize the connection. And so the effects of the United States not having these businesses anymore, these entrances to other countries, will be felt in the long run, with many other policies that have been implemented right now. No, and people, hopefully, they will make the connection, but we never know.
Sandra, you mentioned the climate change initiatives, and it's important to note our show, is broadcast live Monday through Friday on dozens of radio stations, public radio stations, tribal stations across the country. We have Native American people who listen to the show. We have non-Native people who listen to the show. We have people in urban areas, non-urban areas. I want to ask you, though, is it a hard sell to taxpayers in the United States to explain why this country is spending billions of dollars for climate change initiatives in other parts of the world outside of the U.S.?
No, I think when people understand really the importance of partnering with other countries as a soft power, they will realize that the dollar that was, or the 1 cent of a dollar that was going to foreign aid was worth it, because it was coming in other ways, in other businesses for United States. For example, we United States cannot go to a country and say, I want to do business with you because I need a rare mineral do you have? They will say, no, why are you coming to my house to make business here? But with USAID, we use the soft power. We say we can help you to achieve resilience. We can help you to combat climate change, but let us do business. We are partners. That is the way people should see USAID. Besides all the humanitarian aid that, as a human beings, we should feel it. Besides saving lives in Sudan, besides saving lives in Gaza, and all this. Besides that, look at the interest of the countries. They say America first. USAID was helping to maintain America first. And now that gap is being left to other countries to access better businesses, better partnerships around the world, right?
Sandra Lazarte kicking off our conversation here today on Native America Calling. She is the former Indigenous Peoples and Climate Advisor for USAID, and we're talking today about the shutdown of that federal agency and what the impact is potentially and already occurring in Indigenous communities outside of the U.S., globally. We're talking specifically today about global Indigenous issues and how people in other Indigenous communities around the world can be impacted by the shutdown of this federal agency. So if you'd like to join the conversation, we welcome you. Call us, 1-800-996-2848. Tell us your thoughts with regard to the shutdown of USAID. Do you support that shutdown? Do you think it was a bad idea? Would you like to see something change? Let us know. This is your forum, Native America Calling. All you have to do is pick up the phone, call 1-800-99-NATIVE. You can share your comments on the air. Of course, you can also go to our social media. You can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, any of those platforms. You can post, like, comment. You can also visit our website, nativeamericacalling.com. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Walruses are an important subsistence animal for select Alaska Native communities. They've used walruses for food, clothing, artwork, and other purposes for thousands of years. But the changing climate is causing a shift in how Native people interact with walruses. We'll hear about the importance of walruses in Alaska on the next Native America Calling.
Chatlak ida yadus eche kedu shachti kan echexete. Ichti in yukail ataqatla yadus eche sa cake wak aegis. Healthcare.gov/coverage katil qain kachu 1-800-318-2596 kachi Medicare ka Medicaid jidachi qatan aya.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We're getting perspectives about the shutdown of USAID, what it means for Indigenous communities in other countries that received aid. You can join this conversation. Should the U.S. give humanitarian aid to foreign countries? What do you think? Let us know. 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's now bring Brian Keene into our conversation, and he is, among other titles, co-founder of Land and Life. Brian, we referenced a study from the medical journal The Lancet earlier. It estimates that if cuts to USAID programs continue through the year 2040, 14 million people could die. Any reason to question those numbers?
No, I think over the past few decades, we've seen deaths due to famine and natural disasters being cut dramatically, in large part due to the work of USAID. The programs that USAID was funding in countries around the world, it was working in over 100 countries, were programs for HIV, malaria, maternal health, and not to mention the humanitarian assistance that they were doing. So, that's millions of people that were benefiting from USAID, many of whom were in crisis. So, no, I think that the deaths have begun, and I think we're going to see them growing.
Okay. All right. Now, we heard from Sandra earlier. She gave us a general overview of USAID and some of the impacts that she sees taking place already. But perhaps if you could summarize for our listeners briefly just the overall function of USAID and some of the main services that it provided.
Sure. Well, USAID was the primary U.S. government agency that was responsible for administering civilian foreign aid, as well as development and conservation assistance, as I mentioned, in over 100 countries worldwide. So it worked to promote economic growth, global health, democracy, which I think is very important, as well as the humanitarian assistance and crisis response. They also integrated climate change, environmental conservation throughout its programs. So the agency worked to protect biodiversity, critical ecosystems, sustainable resource management, and as Sandra mentioned, to help countries to build resilience to climate change impacts, promoted clean energy, sustainable agriculture, community-based conservation. So a lot of good work. As Sandra said, it wasn't perfect. There were changes that need to be done, but Secretary Rubio did no analysis of what was wrong with USAID. They just kind of took a chainsaw to it, as they talked about. They didn't try to fix any problems with USAID. They just wanted to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. Climate change, food assistance, HIV, AIDS medication, other types of humanitarian aid. I'm going to ask you a similar question to what I asked Sandra earlier. Someone listening to the show right now, they might think to themselves, well, geez, is that really the best use of taxpayer dollars? What's your response?
Yeah, my response is it's a very small percent. Sandra might know the exact percentage, but it's around 1% maybe of the budget. It goes to USAID, and climate change doesn't know borders. So climate change happens, when things are happening in Africa that contribute to climate change, it's going to affect the United States also. This is a global issue, and we're part of the global family. And then also, as Sandra mentioned, USAID, it was sort of a soft diplomacy that allowed the U.S. to have, be the shining country, the example for other countries. And as you mentioned in your introduction, USAID was founded in 1961 to counter Soviet Union influence. And now there's this big gap, and China and Russia are stepping in to fill it. And that's not good for the United States. And it's also not good for the countries that we were supporting, because USAID at least, looked at development as something that you should try to do sustainably, that, human rights should be respected. And, China, like their development bank, their development model doesn't have anything about human rights, does not have any safeguards mandating that they respect human rights, that countries that they donate money to respect human rights.
Okay, that's interesting to note, because what we're seeing in the U.S. is happening in some other countries that are also slashing foreign aid. However, as you know, two global superpowers, Russia and China, they're doing the opposite. They are actually increasing foreign aid. And as you mentioned, in China, perhaps a disregard to human rights in some cases. But is there any possibility, though, that a country like China could continue the mission of USAID with regard to its indigenous people? What's your thought?
I don't think so. I think, you see China is in the Amazon now. It's all around the world. And it's more about getting resources. So they're investing heavily in oil drilling and mining. And as I said before, with no regard to human rights. So I do not see them stepping up all of a sudden and changing the way they do things. And USAID, again, not perfect, but was moving towards a development model with regards to indigenous peoples. It's based on recognition of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, their right to control their territories and the resources in their territories. When I was with the government, I was the primary author of USAID's policy on indigenous peoples, and it states very clearly that any project that impacts indigenous peoples needs to get their free, prior, and informed consent. And when I left, the team that was there, which Sandra was part of, was trying to really get USAID to change so that in all of their programs, they engaged indigenous peoples as partners in the development and conservation processes, and not sort of just as beneficiaries.
Mm-hmm.
So we were moving in that direction.
Okay. Brian, you mentioned USAID said it wasn't perfect, and I think Sandra alluded to some of the same ideas. She mentioned it being a victim of its size, was somewhat critical of the bureaucracy. Do you think there were any changes that could have been made, or any issues that could have been addressed specifically with regard to these efforts to assist indigenous populations across the world? Any changes that could have been made ahead of time to prevent this shutdown, or do you think it was just all part of a master plan?
Oh, no, yeah, it was a master plan. And as I said, they were working towards changing the way they did. They worked with indigenous peoples. They were actually actively changing the way they worked. It's a government organizations are huge, and it's very difficult to change them, but it was changing. So the changes that, they needed to get direct support to indigenous peoples was one of the things that they were working on, to engage indigenous peoples from the get-go when planning development and conservation projects, and engaging them as partners throughout the whole process: development, implementation, evaluation, monitoring. So those kind of changes were happening, but the administration had no interest in making USAID better. They just wanted to get rid of it.
Okay. USAID served places with little to no economic development. So what happens next, Brian? How will people in these places get by without that financial aid they were receiving?
Well, as you said, there'll be a lot of deaths. We'll see more people looking for better life and, migrating a lot towards the U.S. border, I imagine. And then you're going to see sort of a speeding up of illegal wildlife trade in certain areas, deforestation, mining, sort of a development that's not based on long-term thinking, but when people are desperate and when they don't have allies in the development planning process, then the governments and the big corporations sort of have free range to go in and grab lands. So we're going to see a poverty increase, hunger increase, child malnutrition, all of those things will be increasing because of bad development models.
Okay. Now, Brian, you helped improve Indigenous access to USAID international policy making as well. Tell us more about the work that you did and how the relationship that USAID had with Indigenous people prior to what we're seeing now. How did that all unfold, and what was the dialogue? What was the consultation and just the overall partnership there?
Okay, so when basically the senator from Vermont, Patrick Leahy, got written into law that that the government needed an advisor on Indigenous peoples' issues for U.S. foreign assistance. I have been working with Indigenous communities for over 40 years as an activist. So I got a call one day. I went to D.C. and met with a team of people with the government. I had read the mandate that the law gave to this position, and it's all U.S. foreign assistance, so I interpreted that very broadly, including, State Department, USAID, Treasury, all the development banks that the U.S. is part of. And they offered me the job. I accepted because I thought it was a good opportunity to try to make some change. So I reported to the administrator of USAID and the head of F Bureau, which is at State Foreign Assistance. And just went in and tried to look at all of the money that the U.S. sends to other countries. All of it impacts Indigenous peoples, the health programs, the economic development programs, the democracy promotion programs, all of it. And I looked at how do we align U.S. foreign assistance with the way we engage Indigenous peoples in the United States, sort of as country to country, or as peoples with the right to self-determination. And started working on that with Treasury, with regards to the development banks, with State, with USAID. Department of Interior has some funds that go to other countries. And with USAID, I think the big step was to develop a policy. So we put together a team and wrote a good policy. And then we wrote the guidance for each sector. So how do you implement the policy in the biodiversity sector? How do you do it in the education sector, the health sector? And basically that's what was taking place at USAID. Was they were moving forward with implementing the policy throughout the agency. Mm. And so, USAID did not do a great job of getting free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, of engaging them at the start of projects. There were a lot of issues, but there were issues that need to be worked through. And, the same issues you see with big conservation organizations and other development agencies around the world.
All right, Brian, thank you so much. Should the U.S. give humanitarian aid to Indigenous peoples in foreign countries? That's the question today. You can help us answer at 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Our next guest, Andrew Miller, Advocacy Director for Amazon Watch. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. And Andrew, Amazon Watch, you folks issued a press release. It condemned the freeze on U.S. foreign assistance, saying it's causing severe harm to communities in the Amazon. Can you give our listeners more details on these impacts?
Myself and the other great experts on this panel discussion. I mean, I first would like to just say, it's an interesting moment because there are a lot of organizations that historically have had criticisms of U.S. foreign policy broadly, of U.S. foreign assistance in different ways, who are now sort of defending USAID in different ways. I would say that historically USAID is an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, and if we look through the decades, there's a lot of things aspects of U.S. foreign policy to be concerned about over the course of the Cold War, the war on terror, the war on drugs, et cetera. So, I don't want to come out as a cheerleader for USAID necessarily. And I would say also that over the years, Amazon Watch was critical of specific aspects, specific activities or programs of USAID in the Amazon, and I would be happy to talk at more length about those. That said, I think because of the work of people like Brian, of people like Sandra, and many others on the inside of the institution, also because of the work of members of Congress and their staff who care about human rights, and because of the work of indigenous groups themselves who kind of held USAID's feet to the fire in some ways, I really believe that USAID was moving in a much, in a positive direction. And again, because of the pro-IP policy that Brian was very involved in, among others. And we were starting to see in some cases, greater engagement with indigenous communities, with indigenous federations. USAID had a whole localization agenda to try to really make sure that funding ended up in the hands of people on the ground. And, for indigenous peoples around the world in the context of all the climate discussions, we see a lot of talk about the need for direct finance, for climate funds, for assistance of different kinds to go directly to the communities and to the organizations that represent them, as opposed to being channeled through a whole series of intermediaries that end up taking most of those resources. And so USAID was definitely moving in that direction. And, we saw cases in a number of countries in Colombia and Peru and elsewhere where USAID was increasingly supporting the work of indigenous peoples. And, there was one case in Peru where USAID was going to, and, I think even after the election, Samantha Power, the then administrator of USAID, went to Peru and held a press conference and talked about support that they were going to give to indigenous organizations for, to protect defenders, to protect local defenders. Yeah.
Andrew, do me a favor, hold that thought. We have to take a short break and we'll come back and let you talk more about Peru, as well as some of these other criticisms you had.
The annual 2025 Indian Nations Conservation Alliance National Conference happens October 14th in Las Vegas. This 3-day gathering of tribal leaders, professionals, youth, and community members unites voices and action around conservation, innovation, and indigenous stewardship of Indian lands and resources. The Indian National Finals Rodeo will be there too. Info and registration at inca-tcd.org. Inca supports this show.
You're listening to Native America Calling, and there is still time for you to join today's conversation about USAID and the role of the United States in international indigenous communities. Call us. Join the conversation at 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's continue now with Andrew Miller, Director for Amazon Watch, Advocacy Director for Amazon Watch. And Andrew, before that break we just took, you were explaining some highlights from work that USAID performed in Peru. Please continue.
Yeah, so I was just saying briefly that USAID was moving in a direction of providing direct support to indigenous-led programming in the Amazon through different structures. In the Peru case, an umbrella federation called IDACEP, which is kind of an umbrella organization for dozens of different indigenous peoples in the Peruvian Amazon. They were going to receive support from USAID for a human rights defenders program that was really focused on the protection of indigenous leaders who were receiving death threats from mafias and from illegal loggers and miners and drug traffickers. That was one program which ultimately did not receive those funds and is now really struggling to do its work. I know in Colombia there were pretty significant programming that went to indigenous peoples there. And, in terms of the incoming Trump administration, they really saw that as, kind of part of an agenda that they were opposed to, DEI or woke agendas or whatnot. And in fact, I remember there was a kind of at the moment when USAID was being fed into a wood chipper, as it were, one of the ostensibly wasteful programs that was mentioned was just money going to indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian organizations in Colombia. So a lot of the work that we're talking about that we would be supportive of was seen as what was wasteful on the part of Marco Rubio or Elon Musk or Donald Trump or people within the administration. So that's very unfortunate. You know, on the on the critical side, you know, the USAID's work responds to many different interests. And yes, there are currents in favor of democracy and human rights and indigenous peoples that we're really working to increase that. But USAID also historically has been responsive to, you know, the private sector, and which is fine in many cases. But there are also cases where what investors want to do and what multinational companies want to do are essentially inimical to the rights of indigenous peoples. And there was a program a number of years ago during the first Trump administration called Amazon Best Social Environmental Management Practices, which was a 5-year, $24 million USAID-funded activity in which, unfortunately, some multinational companies that really had the strongest conflicts directly with indigenous peoples were the first to try to associate themselves with and to be part of that initiative. And so, you know, there was a risk at the time, and we were critical, and indigenous groups were critical of that initiative as a potential greenwashing mechanism for oil companies, for example. And, you know, but to USAID's credit, and I would say this is kind of what highlights a willingness to take a self-critical view internally and to pivot, to USAID's credit, after receiving criticisms from indigenous peoples, after the first year of that 5-year program, it was canceled. And so, you know, that to me illustrated a willingness internally to really listen to indigenous peoples and to pivot and to change. And that was very important.
All right, thank you, Andrew. 1-800-99-NATIVE. There's still time if you'd like to join today's conversation, share your thoughts with regard to USAID and the impact it had on indigenous communities in other parts of the world. 1-800-99-NATIVE. Our next guest, Leonardo Kripa, joins us now from Mount Vernon, Virginia, where he is the senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. And Leonardo, thank you again for joining today's show. And I know that your work is primarily focused on indigenous rights issues in Central and South America. Tell us more. What is the impact of the withdrawal of U.S. foreign aid in that part of the world?
Generally speaking, what we see at the Indian Law Resource Center is the implications within the decision-making process of international intergovernmental organizations that provide funding to both governments and companies, such as the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank Group. As you may know, these organizations are governed by a board where you will find a director representing a country that has a voting power in decision-making, depending on the money that they contribute to the bank's capital stock. For example, the US has a 30% voting power at the Inter-American Development Bank Group and a 60% voting power at the World Bank Group. And this is the body that makes decisions about projects that they would fund around the world and in the region, policies that would be applied, including indigenous peoples' policies, and findings of accountability mechanisms. And so it's a very important body that decides on a range of issues that are relevant for development purposes in developing countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, these partnerships that USAID had with multilateral banks, give us a little bit more background on these banks. You talked a little bit earlier, but a little bit more detail and your concerns about those types of banks and their impact with indigenous communities in Latin America.
Sure. These banks were basically created after the Second World War And the reason was the governments in the world decided to create these banks for the purpose of reconstructing the economy and infrastructure of the countries that were devastated by the Second World War. And that was the main mandate. Over time, they kind of changed the mandate to focus on eradicating poverty. And as you probably know, the first international human rights instrument was adopted in the early 1940s, and that was after these banks were created. And as a result, the issue of human rights is not an issue that is considered in the mandate of these banks. And so they carry out development work around the world, but without any regard of human rights as we know in the international level. And this is important because the rights of indigenous peoples are protected by treaties, customary international law, declarations, and all of them are collective human rights of, distinctive legal, social, and political entities. And as a result, we see this conflict between development finance and the rights of indigenous peoples in every single issue that these banks do around the world, particularly when they decide on projects, on policies disregarding applicable international human rights law standards that protect the rights of native peoples around the world.
Leonardo, I know you're currently representing a tribe in northern Argentina in a legal fight. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so we're not currently represented, but we are kind of in a fact-finding mission, gathering evidence and the facts of potential case concerning lithium mining in the north of Argentina. The reason is, as you probably know, the shift to renewable energy, this energy transition issue, is basically encouraging more mining, and mining is taking place where the minerals that are necessary for the transition are located. And in the Americas, they are located in what is called the lithium triangle in South America, where you will find the north of Argentina, where I'm coming from, the south of Bolivia, and the north of Chile. And in the north of Argentina, in the province of Jujuy, there are communities where we've seen the government of Jujuy, one of the entities that make up this federal state called Argentina, that has, for example, changed the constitution without any consultation with the indigenous peoples located in Jujuy for the purpose of paving the way for the mining of lithium in their lands. And there are concerns about how environmental protection laws, procedures, and agencies have been dismantled in a way to make it easy for transnational companies to enter the lands that are collectively owned by communities, particularly the Koya communities in the north of Jujuy. And so we are currently assessing the legal framework, the facts of the different cases, and working very closely with around 33 communities that are located in the north of Argentina, including those located in the Jujuy province and in the Salta province.
Leonardo, we heard Andrew mention earlier death threats to indigenous leaders in the Amazon. Have you encountered any other similar types of issues or even crimes? Or I would imagine these are folks who are perhaps speaking out or advocating against some of these political and economic forces that are working against indigenous peoples?
Yes, it is not an isolated matter in the Amazon region. It is spread all over Mexico, Central and South America, particularly in areas that are isolated or possessed by indigenous communities. And the reason being is they are isolated. Some of them don't speak the official language of the state, and they are sitting in areas where there are natural resources where companies are interested in extracting, exploring, exploiting. And so when they speak up, when they take actions to report to the relevant authorities or to media, they are threatened. They don't only receive life threats from third parties, but sometimes governments are complicit of that. And I'm saying this because they start criminally charging leaders and carrying out prosecutions that are unfair. And so this is a concern that many indigenous peoples share in this region. And I'm glad that this issue has been brought to your attention.
Okay. Are there other Latin American countries like Argentina that are rewriting their constitutions? And if so, what effect will that have on indigenous communities?
Anytime, well, Chile very recently changed the constitution. Jujuy province in Argentina changed the constitution. I am not aware of any other country seeking a constitutional change, but anytime a country is seeking to adopt a legislative measure, whether it is a national or provincial law or a constitution, any change in the law, anytime that happens, the country concerned needs to carry out a consultation with the indigenous peoples concerned. And that is not an aspirational right. It is something that is strongly protected by international human rights law. And by that, I mean treaties and declarations that have been either endorsed by the country or ratified by the country, and so they are bound. And if they do not comply with those treaty obligations, they are subject to cases that can be brought against them. And we did that several times. And as a result, they had to change the constitution. They had to change the laws. They had to reform the laws to make it consistent with the applicable international human rights law standard.
All right. Thank you, Leonardo Kripa. And I want to go back to Sandra Lazarte for the last word on today's show. And Sandra, tell us what's next now for indigenous communities that relied on USAID before. What do you see happening in the next few months or even years?
Yeah, Sean. So right now we are in a transition, trying to adjust to the new reality, because it's not only USAID, but also all the organizations that work with USAID that have suffered. So there is a restructuring in the air, and also development institutions, big development institutions are restructuring their approach to indigenous peoples, which is not favorable at this time. And we are seeing that some big philanthropies are stepping up, and they are continuing with the narrative supporting direct financing, supporting self-determination of indigenous peoples, leaderships regarding to climate change. So we are right now in a transition. There is many opportunities for us to continue with our support to indigenous peoples, and there is going to be a lot of adjustments to do. In the meantime, I think we have to keep talking, and I think I appreciate and I thank you, your program. We have to keep talking of the truth behind USAID and how it will affect to American people in the long run, and we cannot keep silent. And we can say that there were lies done to do the job, And so, yeah, I think there is going to be a lot of work to be done. And I know Andrew and Brian, as well as my team, we are committing to continue the support, and we are still going to combine efforts and find collaborations, north, south, and even between partners here. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have now reached the end of our hour, so I want to thank our guests who joined the conversation today: Sandra Lazarte, Leonardo Kripa, Andrew Miller, and Brian Keene. Please join us again tomorrow as we track the effects of climate change on walruses that are a crucial part of Alaska Native subsistence hunting. I'm Sean Spruce. Hope you'll tune in again.
Now more than ever, the supporters of this and all Native One programs deserve a little extra love. Learn more about all our public radio underwriters and web-based sponsors at kowanik.org/supporters-spotlight. Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Kilamik, Ikayaraminyarasi, Okadilugu, Indian healthcare provider, Elitrifsaukufsi, breast cancer screening option, Aperhutakavsi, Naka visitor healthcare.gov/coverage, Naka Kalerlugu, 1-800-318-2596. Unakaira Center for Medicare and Medicaid Service.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Kowanik Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.